On this cool, crisp morning, sunny though, we've been talking in these sessions about polarities and dialectics and things that want to maintain some sort of balance. It occurred to me this past week that there is another kind of balance from Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. These are the best of times. These are the worst of times. Now, I may want to switch that around on occasion. These are the worst of times. These are the best of times. But again, we're living through a tale of two worlds. And we try to hold these in our personal lives, in our civic lives, into some sort of, I won't say harmony, but some sort of balance. And again, if you're like me, it's day by day where that balance point is. And I think that fits into this whole business that we've been trying to think about. And we finished last time thinking about Luther's and the Lutheran notion of two kingdoms, the kingdom on the right, the kingdom on the left, and how they overlap or don't. And, you know, I think I confessed last time that I have sort of abandoned that kind of a notion way back when. But as experience has taught me, there's more going on in real life day by day that causes us to want to think about the relationship between, shall we say, the path of God and the civic path of our collective communal lives day by day in this place, in this time, in this country. I don't think that the notion of the two kingdoms, if we want to use that language of kingdom, that those two realities, realms, are in any sense hardwired into the human experience. They are ways of constructing our thinking theologically that may, if we look at history, determine how best to think about our life as Christians, our life as religious people, and our life as citizens of any country, in any place, in any time. What are the likely consequences of getting this overbalanced to one extreme or the other? And that's a kind of rhetorical question. Today, I want to begin with another one of these dialectics or polarities. And it's obviously not unique to Lutherans at all. It goes back much, much further. And that is Roman numeral number 7. Christ, true man, Christ, true God. It may be a healthy reminder to set this up a little bit, to remember that Jesus was not a Christian. St. Paul, the other great figure of early Christianity, or we'll call it the early Jesus community, was not a Christian either. There was no such thing in their day as Christianity. Jesus was a Jew in the first century of a particular stripe, and there were other kinds of Jews. Likewise with St. Paul. He became a follower of Jesus and became a part of the Jesus community, but there were some other options in those early days. Christianity, as we begin to recognize it, doesn't appear for many decades, indeed centuries, after all of that. And the interesting thing is, then, if Jesus was a Jew who becomes central to Christianity's theological and worship life, the church, early Christianity, is going to have to figure out how Jesus is to be understood. How is Jesus to be understood and indeed be the Christ, the Anointed One, the Messiah? This was one of the great debates in the early period of Christianity. Is Jesus a man? Really a man of some noble character, but nothing more. Is Jesus the Christ, true God, and only appears to be a man? How is that dialectic, that polarity to be understood? Now, we could spend a lot of time. We could spend all 5 weeks just dealing with this issue and the history of it. But I'd like to just suggest that in the earliest periods of the Jesus community, we can see how this notion begins to develop. If you were to read, or if we were to read this morning, I won't read it specifically, Romans chapter 1, verse 4, Paul says, Jesus became Son of God at the resurrection. Okay, fair enough. Then, and Paul's letter to the Romans is written before any of the Gospels are written. Then we go to Mark, which is probably the earliest of the written Gospels. When does Jesus become identified as Son of God? There is no birth account in Mark's Gospel. As we know, he is identified by a voice from heaven at his baptism. As the Son of God. Now, if we go to the next Gospels in the historical sequence as this whole thing unfolds, we go to Matthew and Luke, and there are the two birth accounts. Jesus, at his birth, is something rather special. Then we go to the final Gospel to have been written, John's Gospel, and lo and behold, there is no birth account. There is this prologue. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and so on and so forth. From the foundation of all creation, Jesus is considered to be of God. Now, that didn't obviously end the debates. It was really the earliest installment of a long history in the early period of the Jesus community, in the early period of Christianity. I'm going to just read you the Catholic bishop's version of the second article of the Nicene Creed. Early 4th century, Constantine, the emperor of the Roman Empire, had decided that he needed to assemble the early Christian bishops to his summer palace at Nicaea. I don't know if any of you have ever visited the site. A rather pleasant place on a lake and so on and so forth. And they were going to hammer out what the Orthodox correct belief was, and this, in many ways, most importantly, turned on the question of how to understand Jesus, how to understand Christ. He had perhaps an ulterior motive. If the bishops couldn't agree and they were divided and tearing society apart, the empire apart, he had a problem. He wanted unanimity. He had not yet been baptized, but he had legalized Christianity by the early 4th century, and in 325 he gets the bishops together. Wow. They hassle and they debate, and they come up with the first version of the Nicene Creed. In 389, it's going to be revised again a bit. But here's the Catholic bishops' version. I believe in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son, born of the Father before all ages. God from God, light from light. We heard about light today. True God from true God, begotten and made consubstantial with the Father. Through him all things were made for us men and for our salvation. He came down from heaven and by the Holy Spirit was incarnate of the Virgin Mary and became man. And for our sake he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. He suffered death, was buried, and rose again on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures. He ascended into heaven and is seated at the right hand of the Father. He will come with glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom will have no end. Now, that is an early church conception of how to think about this. This relationship between Jesus being more than just a noble man, Jesus being more than simply otherly world. I pulled off my shelf this week a book by Jaroslav Pelikan. For many years, a historian at Yale, longtime Lutheran until later in his life, he became an Eastern Orthodox Christian. And I used to teach this book. It's entitled Jesus Through the Centuries, His Place in the History of Culture. And you just have to kind of look at some of the chapter titles here, and I'll just read some of them to you. Jesus, the Rabbi, the teacher. Jesus, the turning point of history. We think about BC and AD. The light of the Gentiles, the King of Kings. The cosmic Christ, Ruth. The Son of Man, the true image, the Christ crucified, the monk who rules the world, the bridegroom of the soul, the divine and human model, the universal man, the mirror of the eternal, the Prince of Peace, the poet of the Spirit, the liberator, the man who belongs to the world. And he takes this, as a historian, kind of historical epoch by epoch, and sees how over time Jesus continues to be pictured in different ways, reflective of what may be going on in the church, in the world, or some portion of the church and some portion of the world. I submit to you that in the late 20th century or early 21st century, that has continued. And you can look at the movies. You can look at the movies. Okay? Larry.
One thing you didn't mention was Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yes. Jesus Christ Superstar. How many, let's see here. How about the greatest story ever told? Jesus of Montreal. Have any of you seen that one? Yeah. That's a very different. The Last Temptation of Christ. Some of you have seen that too. The Passion of Christ. Every one of those, in one way or another, is dealing with that issue of how do we understand Jesus. How do we understand Jesus as Christ, of God, or not? Which one is it? Not the greatest story ever told, but the one where he is portrayed as being in league with the Marxists. Now, I'm sure if we were to go around this room, and if we had time, everybody could portray their sense of who this Jesus is. I guess, in this context, my point is, how do we see Jesus as a human being and of God, somewhere in the continuum in the middle? Maybe, Larry, Jesus is the superstar. Okay. Any observations or questions about that kind of dialectic? Tim.
This is an interesting book by Mark Verhoeven, How Jesus Became God. So I read there's lots of books out there.
Oh, indeed. And I mean, you can look at this as a historical / theological question regarding the early period of the church. I don't think. Well, even go back just to at the foundation of this. I don't think there's very much evidence in the available record that Jesus ever thought of himself as a Jewish Messiah. He came to be thought that way by many of his followers. So if you begin from that point, how then does the church construct a Christology? How does it construct a Christology to adequately represent in the church's mind and world and worship that Christ is in fact the object of worship, and how do we express this? That's how did Jesus become God? Now, I think in what came to be normative theological Christianity, he wasn't just God. True man and true God. There are lots of books out there, and for those of us who kind of get off on that sort of stuff, historical, theological stuff, you can see how the church invented itself.
I wonder if the question isn't how, but why.
Yeah, I think both of those things I don't want to choose just one or the other. But why? And it was rooted in a sense, at least in part, of experience, worship experience. And that worship experience is driving this thing forward in different ways, in different corners as the church spreads. And then the question becomes, is there any normative or orthodox way of thinking about this that holds all Christians together? It's having to deal with that issue too. Maybe Emperor Constantine had his own political motives. He did later on end up being baptized as well. And then, except for about a 2-year period, 361 to 363, when Julian the Apostate became emperor and wanted to try to suppress the church. Apart from that, decade after decade, century after century, the church is now not just a minority phenomenon, sectarian phenomenon. It is increasingly an imperial religion, and that is going to last for a good 1,500 years. And many argue that Constantinian Christianity, imperial Christianity, did not come to an end until you get to the 20th century. We only have to go back to the 1950s, 40s, 50s, 60s to realize that there were Christian theologians, perhaps most preeminently Reinhold Niebuhr in this country, and his brother, Paul Tillich, who were cultural intellectuals from a theological point of view. That's hard to imagine too much of that going on, these universal public intellectuals. So, Luman, I think you're right that there's a how and there's a why. Gretchen and then Julie, okay? I think we will assume it's important.
I think we need to keep in mind that all of us view Jesus however we define him through our own cultural and spiritual lens.
I think that's true. Hopefully we all do it through, as well, a tradition.
I want to just say a couple of things. One is that the use of the word kingdom is so much a part of the imperial church. And so I think many of us try to say kingdom because it so much more reflects the nature of God, of Jesus. And then I want to say that on the one hand, this baby that comes in the form that we all come, a little child, and then the cosmic Christ on the other hand, and we wrestle with that all our lives.
Probably no surprise. I agree with the lady.
Well, the establishment of creeds leads to orthodoxy, which is convenient, but also leads to the possibility of heresy.
And it kind of spoils the concept of diversity.
I think so. In the first session, I said, if you recall, that I'm more at home in a confessional church than a teaching strictly Orthodox church. But I don't think the issue of orthodoxy, I think that the orthodoxy may help us prevent certain things that we don't want to affirm as well. Kelly.
I'm wondering if it's in the questioning and trying to figure out where God is, where Jesus is, if he's, all man, all God, if it's that in-between place, the searching is where we find him. And when we take away the searching and say, we just believe this doctrine or whatever, and we stop thinking, that we lose it. So we go back to the questions and certainty thing.
You're speaking to the choir. You're speaking to me anyway.
As long as the microphone is over here. I thought your point about Jesus not being a Christian and Paul not being a Christian is intriguing. But it strikes me that we may actually have it easy, at least in part, because of our separation from Jesus the man. Back at the very beginning, the New Testament is full of stories about the disciples' struggles to grasp their discipleship and how to relate to this guy named Jesus.
Peter, who became St. Peter, Thomas, right on down the line, right? Yeah. Steve?
I think one thing I think about it as to the question of how or why Jesus became God, it's because the humanity as a whole, when I say we needed him to, even or particularly at an unconscious level, we need that. And I could say a lot more about that, but that gets into like Jungian psychology and all of that, so I won't. But we need a true God and true man, even if only at an unconscious level.
Okay, good point, Steve. I would simply observe that when we divorce Jesus from Judaism, the step from that to anti-Judaism, anti-Semitism, is not all that great. And that's an utter tragedy. Jews, just an experience. I remember, as a new faculty member, our department getting an invitation to the local synagogue that was without a full-time rabbi at the point, and they had a guest rabbi coming from Dallas, I think, and going to speak on the whole notion of Messiah in Judaism. And I thought, well, I'll go over there. And so we sat in the basement of the synagogue, and he began in a very interesting way. He tried to remind the members of the Jewish community there that the notion of a Messiah was a Jewish notion. I thought that was kind of interesting. We Christians would take that pretty much for granted about Jews. But the healthy reminder is that the notion of Messiah as it appears in early Judaism isn't necessarily what comes to predominate in Judaism after the first century. In Rabbinic Judaism, where Torah, the law, is portrayed as being given by God to Moses on Mount Sinai, and then the whole law. So the bridge is not Christology, or necessarily for a whole lot of Jews anyway, the notion of Messiah. It's Torah. You go ahead, move beyond Christianity by about 6 centuries or so, you get to Islam. Jesus is important to Muslims, but not as a messianic figure. What is important is Quran, given from God through Muhammad to the community. So all three of these great religions have some notion of the heavenly, the eternal, however you want to describe it, the divine, being bridged to the human, whether it's Quran, whether it's Torah, or Christology. And I think, Steve, that probably links up with what you're getting at. There is a need on the part of human beings to be connected in some sense to that which is transcendent. Now, today, we know there are plenty of atheists. In the 16th century, I think atheism probably wasn't really an intellectual option. In the post-Enlightenment world, it may very well be. Or, at least for some people. Okay? If I'm really lucky, I'll be able to trip over that wire sometime today. Let's go on to another one. These are a series of dialectics, I think, here. And I have some images. So we're looking at Roman numeral 8. Written word, spoken word, semicolon, visual word, and embodied word. If this works, I can stay out of the way. Could we just turn the light down a little bit, maybe? Yeah. It's probably well known to you that in Jesus' day, or in the early Jesus community day, early Christianity, people were largely in that part of the world living in an oral society. So when you think about word, you think about an oral word. They had a professional class known as scribes who dealt with texts and writing and reading in that sense. And it is also the case that the texts, the written word, that was manifested in Jewish communities, of course, was in terms of a scroll. This is a now decommissioned synagogue in a place called Tetuan, Morocco, and turned into a museum because in recent times, most of the Jews in that community, once the modern state of Israel was established, emigrated to Israel. There are still Jews in Morocco, but this fellow was identified as a rabbi, and you see the scrolls that once communicated the word in written form to the Jewish community. the Christian community, by and large, the early Jesus community, by and large, had access to these Jewish scrolls, but they develop another form of written word. Now, that doesn't mean in the early Christianity that everybody could. Where did I leave it? Oh, here it is. That doesn't mean that the Okay. I'll just take it out here. It doesn't mean that all early Christians could read or write either. But there was a change in the form, and that is the codex, a precursor to the book, which was largely a pile, perhaps sewn together, of pages of the text. And this is an image of the great Sinaiticus Codex, which is housed at St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai at the foot of Mount Sinai. This became a way of visualizing and using the written word. Now, we think of word in other ways other than just the oral or written. We also think of the embodied word. Michelangelo's Pietà. Those of you who've been to St. Peter's will know that as soon as you come in the main doors to your right, this embodied sense of the word. I suppose we can see this as well in a crucifix today. The embodied the body of Christ on the cross. So when we start thinking about how Christ is represented, orally, written, or in sculpture, this is the castle from the Castle Church in Wittenberg. And this isn't, it's going to show up. There's a pulpit there. Martin Luther would preach. So again, a particular manifestation of spoken oral word. This is Martin Luther when he was, I guess, virtually hiding and imprisoned in the Wartburg Castle. This was his study. And what did Martin Luther do? He translated the Bible into the common, ordinary German of ordinary folks because he believed that the Word of God, the Word of Christ, did not need to be mediated through the hierarchy of the church, but people, assuming they were able to read and understand the common German, could then have direct access to it. That's what it looks like. Ha-ha. There's the Brother Martin the friar, right there, with the book in his hand. Now, Christianity, global Christianity today, is not of one mind about the notion of word or of Christ. The whole Eastern tradition is resplendent with icons and images. In the Western Church, there was a great iconoclastic controversy about the appropriateness of icons and so on and so forth. The Western Church went one way, the Eastern Church another. This is the iconostasis in a renovated monastery church in Yaroslavl, Russia, and you see how each one of those panels represents part of the Christian story and the individuals. Now, an icon is not just artwork. It, in a sense, communicates what it is. And you can go to any Orthodox Eastern tradition church, and you're going to see a manifestation of it. Relating back to the figure of Jesus as man and Christ, and the whole Christian story as it is communicated, is filled with these perplexing dialectics of oral word, spoken, written word, text, and obviously images and image word and embodied word. And we're not done yet. You can see here, that's another Russian Orthodox triptych. This is Greek Orthodox from one of the monasteries at Meteora monasteries in Kalimbaka, Greece. And you can see the somewhat different notion of the Greek Orthodox tradition. And now, in Leipzig, the Thomaskirche, Bach's place, the musical word. Think about, it's hard to even imagine it because it's so vast. Think about all the Bach music. And where was that situated? In the concert hall? No. In the Thomaskirche. In a church setting. You don't have to walk too many feet from here into the sanctuary at St. Andrew to see, again, how notion of word in music, in liturgy, and so on, is represented. Now this gets, we'll just leave that up, that's nice. We realize that this is not the end of the story. I used to say to students, imagine going to a Catholic cathedral and imagine it's a high festival mass where one would normally expect the procession of the Holy Book, and you would see it. Imagine if they carried their computer or phone. You have the words, and then in the middle of the congregation, they read the lessons based on some stored electronic impulses. It gives an entirely different notion of how the word is understood. Now, we may have long since surpassed that. One wonders if we are not going through our audiovisual technology to a pre-literary world. Maybe I'm just a curmudgeonly old gray-haired guy. But it does affect how these, like ours, worshiping communities have a complex and expanded notion of the word and how it is experienced, communicated, encountered. I really would not mind if we had the Michelangelo's Pietà here. Be kind of nice. Don't think we're going to get it. So again, you can flip the light back up here. We're thinking about certain kinds of polarities and the richness of this. Many years ago, a book titled Amusing Ourselves to Death. Some of you will probably have read it. And, you know, the point is still valid, even though in many ways it's out of date. But Neil Postman argues, basically on the basis of the ubiquity of television at that point, that we are blessed or cursed. And it's even more true now in the 21st century. We're either blessed or cursed by having all these different means or methods of communicating. This even goes back to Marshall McLuhan. And, you know, the medium is the message stuff from when some of us were in college. And I'll never forget, Neil Postman, very early on in that book, says, now, think about this. Every one of these means of communicating, or, you know, methods, from writing a personal letter to communicating with television or some other form like that, has its strengths and weaknesses. And I think he, if I remember correctly, he points to TV. Isn't necessarily a very good medium for communicating serious intellectual ideas. What it can do, it can create an emotional response, just as we might see from some videos this past week. But he said, you know, if you want to discuss ancient Greek philosophy, the medium of communication of using smoke signals probably won't work very well. Now, a smoke signal is can be a way of communicating certain things rather effectively. Emojis. Yeah. I mean, this whole thing has progressed. But what that suggests, to me anyway, is that when we communicate and what we want to communicate and how we communicate it and how we listen to it or engage it, encounter it, has to be thoughtfully considered, that we use the right medium of communication or a responsible and good one. You know, working with younger adults, college-age kids for a long time, I'd say, okay, you're in a romantic relationship with somebody else. and you decide that you want to end it. You have some options. You could write a personal letter, put it in an envelope, put a stamp on it, and send it. I'm done. You could send a text message. Maybe if you're really sophisticated, an email. Or today, you might put it on social media as a public announcement. I'm done with you. Or you could sit down face to face and talk it over. You take your point. You pick your medium here. What is most appropriate for the occasion and for the situation, the message? And I think when we live in complex times, when we live in complex media environments, and when we think about Christianity and the notion of word related to Christ, let's say, related to God, let's say, we may want to think with some sophistication about what the appropriate modes of communication are. Now, we've worshiped online various times, certainly during the pandemic and other. I think many people realized at that point that was not going to go away once the pandemic had ended. I think that's probably the right decision. But at least for me, and I speak just for myself, that's not the best mode of worship and communication in worship. It may be, when I am so old, feeble, and decrepit, more so than I am now, that's all I've got. Or when the snow drifts the power's still on, but the snow drifts are so deep and the temperature is so cold that it's hazardous to go out. Everybody's going to answer that question a little bit differently, perhaps. I'd like to, just for the sake of my own agenda anxiety here, I want to think about not just a bunch of polarities like these notions of word, but just the interpretation of the tradition. And here, because I'm kind of a textual guy, I think about interpretation of biblical texts. You may have heard me say before that I think reading and interpreting biblical texts is a matter of a conversation between whatever a text is and the interpreter. And that's always a shifting conversation because our context, our frame of reference is always shifting. As we heard today in the sermon, our cloud of darkness may be different from time to time, and our own historical and social context affects this. And the biblical text is encountered in that interaction between text and interpreter, and out of that meaning is generated. In other words, meaning of the biblical text word is not simply contained in the words on a page. Neither is it simply contained in whatever I happen to feel about that text, and it's what I want it to mean rather than maybe what it might mean. Authority is in the interaction between the two, in the middle, if you will, And I would say it's not only a faithful middle, but it's a radical middle. Obviously, conversation is a metaphor here. But you can be a good conversationalist or a bad one when it comes to encountering biblical texts in the conversation of that. But there's a polarity there. It isn't just what I want it to mean. And it isn't just what it may have meant to somebody in the 1st century, the 4th century, or the 16th century. And I suspect next Sunday, Ruth, when we hear about the cosmic story, similar things are going on as we think about texts, words, images, and so on. We may not be professional cosmologists. We may not be professional astronomers or physicists or anything else. Tom Melhorn is one, but most of us aren't. But we do know certain things. And there's no likelihood we're going to unlearn those things, or should we? How do we bring them to manifestations and epiphanies in our world? We're finished for today. We have one more session, and I'm going to get to some of these other things here. Obviously, as I told you at the outset, we're kind of picking our way through. Where we end, we'll see next time. Exactly. I know a couple things we're probably going to have to leave out, but that's okay. Does anybody want to make a concluding, summarizing statement today? Or concluding question? Thank you as always for coming. These are the best of times. These are the worst of times.